Hey guys, it's Cody. I'm on day 90 of the Odin project, and today I finished creating my tests for my SensoryLexicon factory function. So that finishes off the factory functions and the testing for them. I did it backwards in regards to test-driven development. It was more of making my factory functions and then realizing I had to make tests, or I wanted to make tests, and then going back and doing that. So not ideal, but I've got some tests done so that if I do make modifications or updates to those factory functions in the future, I have some tests to cover me there. In addition to that, I worked on integrating those new factory functions back into the forms within the application. I was using classes before, so there's some slight differences in how I'm approaching it now with these factory functions. So we'll take a look at what that integration is starting to look like so that I can then eventually get back into actually building out the UI. So let's take a look at the tests for the SensoryLexicon. So if we look over here, we have something that you guys probably saw before with the last vlog, was the test for the addition of one attribute to a lexicon. And I did make some slight modifications with this, but overall this series of nested tests are testing for modifications to the lexicons for complex modifiers. So these aren't simple setters for properties and values. These are for the arrays that I have within the SensoryLexicon, specifically the attributes array. So this first block is to test the add attribute modifier, and specifically to test the addition of attributes. This first block within that add attribute block is to test just one attribute, and so I did have this working last time, and I had the appropriate functions and everything working with that. I did add a block here to test out this specific function with get specific attribute to make sure that once the attribute was added, then we were able to actually get that specific attribute using that method within the lexicon. And so this should spit back a attribute that is within the attributes array of the lexicon, specifically one that has this ID. And then we do some expect tests down here to make sure that this specific attribute has a method that returns an object, and that object is an instance of being an object. And then here we are getting the name property from that specific attribute, and it should be lemony. Next is to get the attribute ID and confirm that that is the correct ID. Fairly straightforward from that perspective. I didn't have anything specifically testing this method, so I wanted to get that in here somewhere. And so I put it in there. Going down here, we see something a bit more complex. We're adding 4 attributes now, so we have some tests for that as well. It's actually fairly straightforward. It's just doing the same thing, but instead of doing 1 attribute, it's going to do 4. And so we expect the length of the array to be 4 now. Again, checking for the date modified being updated appropriately. Down here is the add reference to specific attribute method that we're testing. So we're going to add multiple attributes to the SensoryLexicon, which is what we see here with attribute 1, attribute 2, attribute 3, and then there's a 4th attribute down below the screen. And attribute 1 has an AID, which is the attribute ID of 1, 2, 3, respectively. And we're going to add multiple different attributes, mainly different in that they have a different ID. Down here, so we're adding 3 attributes. Oh, I thought there was a 4th one. Yeah, well, you guys get the point. So 3 attributes are being added here. And again, I'm doing a test for the date modify that's specific here. So specifically, I'm getting the post attribute add date modified. So I'm added all these attributes. The date modified should be different from the date added to begin with. And then the reason why I have that is because I'm going to test after I add a reference to a specific attribute if the date modified was actually updated after doing that. So that's where we see here is where we're testing the addition of 1 reference to 1 attribute. And this test is to check to see that 1 reference is added to the first attribute. So we have reference 1 here, and we're going to use our lexicon object to add a reference to a specific attribute. It's going to be reference 1 that's being added to the attribute with an ID of 1, which would be attribute 1 in this case. And we're going to expect that the lexicon will then be able to get the specific attribute of ID 1 and to have a get ref count returning 1 for that attribute. And so what that means is that within the attribute object that is within the array, attributes array of the lexicon, there should be a reference within the references array of that attribute. And so then the length of that should be coming back as 1, which is what this get reference count does. It's calculating the length of the array. And then down here, we're checking to make sure that the date modified is not the same as the date modified after adding those 3 attributes. And then after that, we're just making sure that the date modified is different from the get date added, which is pretty standard, and we've tested that several times before in the other setters. Down here we have testing of the addition of 2 attributes for 1 attribute. It's pretty much the same thing that we got going on down here. So that's all we have for this test. If we go over here, there was some things that I needed to update. So the get specific attribute, I had this just getting the attribute by its .id property, which was an old way of doing that I had in the past with the class. Now I needed to actually use this get attribute ID getter within that attribute object to actually find that attribute by its attribute ID. Didn't really have to change anything here, but this is one of the main things I was testing, as you guys remember. And then you guys will see I have a get lexicon object, which is something I'll be using within the integration for the actual rendering within React. So that leads us to the add pages. Previously I had a lexicon within state and it was just an empty array that was being utilized within state. Now I'm going to start using that SensoryLexicon factory function to actually have an initial state for that lexicon. And that way I have access to those methods for adding to the lexicon and modifying, getting specific things from the lexicon. As you can see here, I need to add an object because within my SensoryLexicon factory function, it takes a lexicon object to begin with, and that can be empty to start out with. But I add that lexicon to the outlet so then it's available. Specifically, it's going to be helpful to be available at the menus for the references and menus for the attributes for adding additional to see what attributes, what references are currently added by the user. And so that's pretty much it with that page. Not much from an integration standpoint except for that little snippet right there with the state. So let's go over to add lexicon. For here, what mainly changed was within this try catch for adding to the database the lexicon information. So previously I had this object right here that was being submitted directly to the database, and then I was just using the variables that I had set to build that object down here to add to the lexicon with the different setters for the lexicon class. Now I'm creating a new lexicon, and I'm actually going to use that getLexicon object method to actually return just the object of the properties themselves, and that will be added to the database. And then once the database actually spits back a lexicon ID, then I will set that lexicon ID using the docref ID from this and setting it within the lexicon. And then once that's set, I'll modify the outlet state to have the new SensoryLexicon with the ID and all the appropriate user input. Moving on to the add attributes. So I actually send the lexicon ID over with this new lexicon.getLexiconID method. And we also send the product name over to there. And this is fairly similar stuff. I mean, very similar stuff to what I had before, just updating it to be in line with the factory function methods. And so we see a similar thing here. The new attribute is being set with the sensory attribute factory function, and I'm passing that as an object to this factory function to get this new attribute. Going to use the new attribute .return method down here to get the object and send that to the database. I have a note here to add citation to the form. That's something I don't have within the UI just yet, but it was something I was building out with the factory function. And then down here we see that I'm setting the ID. Just like the sensory lexicon, I get the ID from the database and I'm going to set it. Unlike the lexicon, I'm going to actually add this attribute to the attribute array of the lexicon. So that's what we have going on here. And then once that's done, those two things are finished, then we're going to modify the lexicon on the outlet state with this lexicon here. And then similarly, we're going to pass some data over to the next page, which will be add references, which I haven't fully integrated yet. I'm not going to show you that just yet. That's all I have for you guys today. So if you have any questions, then definitely let me know. If you're interested in following mine and Emily's journeys into web development, hit subscribe. Let me know if you like this video, and I will see you guys tomorrow.